In the book of 1 Kings, chapter 3, we have the story of Solomon, King Solomon. He's going to offer God the sacrifice, and he ends up, in the night, he ends up having this dream. And in the dream, God asks him, ask whatever you want. What do you want? What would you like me to do for you? And Solomon says, well, if I'm going to lead your people, I really need to have wisdom. I need you to give me a really wise heart so I'll know what I'm going to do to lead your people. And God is very impressed with this. And he says, well, you didn't ask for riches and wealth and for your enemies to be destroyed and all these things. And God's like, that's pretty impressive. Instead, you asked for what was best for my people. And so I will give you the wisdom you've asked for. In fact, I'll give you even more. I'll give you what you didn't ask for. And God is very pleased with this answer. And I think it's an interesting concept here that so often when it comes to the will of God and God's plan for our lives, we very often fall into thinking somehow it's about me, that God's will must be about me. Solomon might have been tempted to think, well, God made me king so that I will be king, and isn't this great? I have this great victory, and it's for me that he made me king. But it wasn't. And he recognized that. And Solomon realized, if I'm going to lead your people, I need your wisdom. And so he recognized his position wasn't the will of God for Solomon. It was the will of God for God using Solomon. And so often we miss this. And I find this very, very common in our day and age. A lot of times I fall into that trap sometimes, thinking that somehow God's will is to bring about these great things for my life. And we think that God's will is somehow centered on us, but it's not. God's will is centered on him. It's his will. And we're his servants. And so it's not for us, it's for him. We're here to serve him, right? I mean, that's the fact. We're here. We weren't created for our good. We were created for his. And we weren't created for our glory. We were created for his. God didn't make us because he desperately needed to make us. He made us for him. And so we need to remember that when we're looking for God's will from the very beginning. You don't exist for yourself. You exist for him. And so we need to determine God's will in some other way. We need to think about God's will being, what can I do for your will? How can I adapt my will for you? And so that's really where we need to search. It can be difficult sometimes. We can say, well, how do we know what God's will is? How can we know what God's plan for my life is? And we can have these criteria sometimes where we think things. So sometimes we'll think every time that you have a good outcome, that must be God's will. That proves that God's will is. I looked at this in my life and I prayed to God and look, it turned out so nice and rosy. That proves that it was God's will. And we think that these positive outcomes are God's will. I prayed that so-and-so would be healed of their disease, and they were. So see, God's will was done. Wait, but if you prayed and they didn't get healed of their disease, do you know that God's will was still done? Or do you think that somehow God's will, it didn't happen? There was some, maybe Satan was more powerful than God in that story or something. Or I didn't pray good enough, and so I lost God's will. And we get this weird way of thinking. And we somehow think that the outcomes determine whether or not it was God's. And if it turns out in a way that we approve of, then that must prove that it was God's will. But that's not the way it works. God's will is his. And the outcome that we see isn't actually even the outcome. I mean, God is still working even beyond that. God's working through the threads of all history. And every step is just a step toward another goal. And so we look at each of these moments, and sometimes we like what we see, and so we decide it's God's will. Some people do this with the happiness thing. Oh, I'm so happy, and God I knew God was working it out this way because now I'm so happy, right? The fact that I'm happy shows that it must be God, or peace. We'll use peace, right? Oh, because I feel such a peace about it, so I know God's will is being. Really? I mean, think about these things, like the whole idea of how it turns out. How it turns out must be God's will. If you look at Judges chapter 1, verse 19, there's this verse that's very hard to handle if you believe that the outcomes prove God's will. Because it says in Judges 1:19, it says, now the Lord was with Judah, meaning he's doing his thing, and they're with him. He's with them. So now the Lord was with Judah, and they took possession of the hill country. Yay! There it is, a good outcome, must be God's will. But they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had iron chariots. Now, that's odd. What if the Lord was with them, then why couldn't they overcome the iron chariots? Is God not strong enough to take on iron chariots? I mean, it seems so odd, right? Well, the assumption is that it couldn't possibly be God's will that they couldn't drive out those inhabitants. But it was God's will. It wasn't God's will that they win that battle. It was God's will that they fail to drive out those particular people. And so God's will was done. It's just in how we're assessing it. When we think that our desired outcome, then what we're really doing is we're seeking our will, not God's. And the other one, the whole idea of my peaceful feelings, my emotions. So sometimes we think my emotions determine God's will. That's a very dangerous place to be. Because if we think that, then we'll wait for our emotions to line up, and then we'll just simply declare that God's will has been done. Well, if I feel a peace about it. Well, just think about Jonah. I mean, the story of Jonah is full of God's will being done. He wasn't very happy about it anywhere in the whole book. He starts off, God says, go to Nineveh and do this. That's God's will. And Jonah is distressed, and he flees to Tarsus. And as he's on the boat going, a storm comes because God's saying, no, my will is that you go back this way. And Jonah, well, in that moment, maybe peaceful because he kind of fell asleep. So maybe, I guess, but that he was violating God's will. And then the storm got so bad, they thought they were going to have to do something, and they were going to draw straws to see whose fault it was. And Jonah knew he was the one. And so he says, you got to throw me overboard, guys. God's upset with me. And you think that he was at peace about that? I think he was pretty distressed about it. I think he was so distressed he'd rather die than turn back. So they throw him overboard, and he ends up in the belly of a whale. I'm pretty sure he didn't feel any peace there. And when we read his prayer from the belly of the whale, we can see that, no, he repented. And God tells the fish, not the whale, but the fish to go back. And he spits him up on the shore, and Jonah reluctantly goes to Nineveh, and he preaches and preaches almost in an angry preaching, right? God's going to destroy your city. Do you think he felt peace as he was doing God's will? And then he sat on the edge of the city and looked down at it and watched to see what would happen. And God doesn't destroy them. And he's angry. And God says, why are you angry? I knew it. I knew you wouldn't destroy them. See, he was angry and God's will was being done. You can't trust your emotions to tell you when God's will is being done. Because once again, it's not your will, it's his. And sometimes it's hard. Sometimes God's will is contrary to ours and will cause us to be unhappy because it's not what we want. And that's what it is to submit, is to say, God, I don't want this, but I will do it anyway. Even Jesus, not my will, yours be done. How do you know God's will then? How do you do it? If it's not based on the outcomes we see, and if it's not based on our emotions, our sensing of God, well, how do we know? Well, there's two really important verses in the Bible that tell us. Romans 12:2, where it says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. Learning to think like God will make you much more aware of what it is God wants. When we ask God, change my way of thinking, transform me by the renewing of my mind, I will then know your will better than before. I will start to learn to perceive and determine, discern the will of God, because I will be thinking like God. I'll be increased in that. So that's the first one. And the second one is found in Proverbs 3:5-6, where it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. And what this is kind of telling us is God's will is going to be done. You actually don't even need to find it. All you need to do, trust in the Lord. Lean on him, not in your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him as God. Submit to him as God. And his will be done. Even if you don't discover that it was done, you can be sure that it was. And that's really what it's all about, because after all, it's his will, not yours, that we're trying to find. And really, that's a good thing. His will is a good thing. Well, something to think about.